All right, guys, I want to share with you this report from FAIR, which is Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. They did a little comparison here. So they looked at the coverage in the media of the Iraq War and compared it to the coverage of the war in Ukraine. Now, in the case of Iraq, the United States of America was the aggressor. We did an illegal and offensive war against a country that didn't attack us. And in the case of Ukraine, Russia is the one that did the illegal and offensive invasion against a country that didn't attack them. So, on paper, these things are actually very similar if you're looking at it fairly. Well, look at this. Invasion news fits on front page more when an enemy does the invading. Interesting. So they say, the New York Times slogan, "All the news that's fit to print," has appeared on the paper's front page since 1897, but a comparison of Times coverage of the 2022 Ukraine war and the 2003 invasion of Iraq shows that the same kinds of news don't always fit on the front page. FAIR examined front pages of the New York Times between April 1st and April 30th, 2022, and compared them to those from May 1st to May 31st, 2003. The dates represent the second full calendar months of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the U.S. invasion of Iraq, respectively. Major armed conflicts involving major world powers illegally invading smaller countries. In April 2022, there were a total of 179 stories on the Times front page, and 79 of them, 44%, concerned the Ukraine invasion. All but 3 were located at the top of the page, where editors put the stories they consider to be the most important of the day. Fully 75% of all top-of-the-page stories were about the Ukraine war. Not a single day went by without a Ukraine story being published on the top of the page. And on 14 different days, only stories about Ukraine were published on the top of the front page. Okay, so you guys get the gist of it? 75% of all the top page stories were about the Ukraine war. 75%. In May 2003, when there were 226 stories on the front page, only 41 of them, which is 18%, reported on the Iraq invasion. 32 of those were at the top of the page, with 9 below. 25% of all top-of-the-page stories were dedicated to the Iraq war. Wow. It dropped off a cliff. 75% to 25%. This means that a major conflict launched by the country where the paper is published was given less than half as many front-page articles, and a third of the top of the front page where highest priority stories are placed compared to a war in which that country was not directly involved. 6 days out of the month, the paper did not feature a single Iraq story at the top of the page, and the top of the page stories were never exclusively about Iraq. Wow. So way more coverage to the war in Ukraine than we got about the war in Iraq. The apparently greater newsworthiness of military aggression when committed by an official enemy isn't just on display on the Times front page. A study of ABC, CBS, and NBC nightly news shows found that the first full month of the Ukraine war got more coverage, 562 minutes, than the peak month of coverage of the Iraq war, 455 minutes. So here you see, look at this chart here. So percent of front page stories, 44% for Ukraine, 18% for Iraq. Percent of top page stories, 75% for Ukraine, 25% for Iraq. Now here's another portion that I think is devastating. Civilian deaths, newsworthy or not. Of the 79 front page New York Times articles, New York Times stories on the war in Ukraine in May 2022, 14 of them were primarily about civilian deaths as a result of the Russian invasion, all of which appeared at the top of the page. As FAIR has argued in the past, coverage of the civilian toll of a war is well warranted, as civilians usually face the worst impact of modern warfare. By the beginning of May, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights estimated that there were at least 3,153 civilian deaths in Ukraine. In contrast, during the month of Iraq coverage, there was only one story about civilian deaths at the hands of the U.S. military on the front page. A report describing an event in which U.S. soldiers killed 2 protesters. The lack of coverage, however, did not reflect a lack of civilian casualties during this period. Iraq body count estimated that at least 7,984 civilian deaths had occurred by the end of May 2003. Wow. Wow. So 14 stories, primarily about civilian deaths in Ukraine as a result of the Russian invasion. There was one about the civilian deaths in Iraq. One. Even though there were way more Iraqi civilian deaths than Ukrainian civilian deaths. 7,984 Iraqi civilian deaths, 3,153 Ukrainian civilian deaths. Now, that's not me saying those Ukrainian civilian deaths don't matter. In fact, there should be a hell of a lot of reporting on innocent civilians being killed in a war. Absolutely. But why is it doesn't get much coverage when it's us killing the civilians? Other stories about Iraqi non-combatants being killed in the war sometimes made the paper, but not on the front page. The Times has a history of downplaying civilian casualties at the hands of the U.S. military. The contrast between intense interest in civilians killed by Russia and minimal interest and minimal attention to civilians killed by the United States matches a previous FAIR study. It found 27 mentions on the nightly network news shows in the first week of the Ukrainian invasion, identifying Russia as responsible for harming civilians, as compared to 9 mentions in the first week of the Iraq invasion that reported on the U.S. harming civilians. Fewer than the 12 mentions that depicted the U.S. helping Iraqis. So look, guys, this is manufacturing consent. This is propaganda. And by the way, this is what happens when a lot of the sources for TV news and for print outlets are in the intelligence community and in the Pentagon. So they will paint for them a rosy picture of how we are the benevolent, altruistic do-gooder and we're just liberating people. But the view of Russia and what they're doing is, look, they're doing an illegal and offensive invasion and they're the aggressor and they're the bad guy. Look, I think the fair way to cover Iraq and the fair way to cover Ukraine is very simple. The U.S. is the aggressor in Iraq. Russia is the aggressor in Ukraine. And the primary focus should be on the innocent civilians who are being killed and to tell the story behind that. But you can see there's a lot of obfuscating and deflecting around the U.S. doing it, and they run puff pieces at the same time. A handful of times they cover civilian deaths. Whereas in Russia, the stories are Russia bad, Russia bad, Russia bad, over and over. So, look, you guys get the gist of this, but here's the main point. This generalizes across U.S. media. I need you to understand that. This generalizes across U.S. media. You do not get a story about, U.S. did bad thing in foreign policy. Or even, God forbid you ever question the intentions of the U.S. government in foreign policy. You'll never get that. Because when it's about us, they bring not just all the nuance in the world, but all the excuses in the world. But when it's any official enemy state, they break out the whooping stick. And look, go do the test yourself. You could do this anecdotally. You could look for yourself. Go find the stories that discuss any of the official enemy states of the U.S. Venezuela, Iran, Russia, North Korea. The bigger an enemy state they are, the more you're basically permitted to completely make shit up and even lie. Half the stories that come out about North Korea are total propaganda from U.S. intelligence agencies trying to make North Korea look even worse than they are, which, by the way, you don't need to do. There's enough crazy shit going on there anyway. There's enough insane stories that are real coming out of there. But there's a lot of propaganda that comes out that even tries to portray them as worse than they are, more absurd than they are. And this is what you find. If it's an official U.S. enemy state, you could say whatever, and you should be relentless in your messaging that these countries are bad. But when it's us, everything is spun and twisted and, portrayed as, well, at the very least, we mean well. So that's bullshit. I want a picture painted of the world from the news outlets that is accurate, that is factual, that is a fair analysis and a fair narrative, and you never get it. And this is just such a good example where you have two very comparable situations, the Iraq War and the Ukraine War. And the media is just totally out to lunch when it comes to reporting on us, and they're hammering away when it comes to reporting about Russia. Now, again, I think it's There's nothing more fair than reporting on civilian deaths in a war, and I'm happy they did that in Ukraine. But they should have done it more in Iraq. And shit, they should be doing it right now. We're still in Iraq, you know? We're constantly in some sort of military intervention somewhere around the world. So I'd like a little bit more of that objectivity for ourselves. So as you can see here, the media is biased as ever, and this is more proof. If you want to see me and Crystal Ball interview legends like Noam Chomsky, Cornel West, and more, subscribe to Crystal, Kyle, and Friends on Substack. $5 a month gets you the video version a day early. Remember, we take 0 ad dollars for this podcast. Or you can sign up on Substack for free and get the audio version a day later. Link in the video description box below.